So welcome everyone. We have our next speaker with us, Felix Crux, and he'll be talking on what you need to know about open source licenses. Thank you. Let's invite Felix.
Hi everybody. Thanks for coming. I know there's some really fascinating, exciting talks going on right now, so I appreciate that you chose this one. I guess you lot are the really serious-minded folks that really love legal stuff. Like you're really pumped right now. Like, yeah, let's read some legal licenses. I don't know. Maybe you just figured out that there's more power outlets or the Wi-Fi works better in this room or something. But anyway, hi. My name is Felix, and this talk is what you need to know about free and open source software licensing. And I wanted to talk about this topic because even though free and open source software are ubiquitous now, the legalese that makes it all work can be kind of confusing and boring and even intimidating. And sometimes you might think it's pointless and just a bunch of magic incantations that you just have to chant in the correct way and hope that everything works out all right. But really, it turns out that the core ideas that underpin the system are actually pretty easy to understand. And if you take the time to do so, like by coming to this talk, it not only helps you see why things are the way they are, but it actually gives you new tools, new ways to influence and control how your software is used, and to help you make sure it achieves the goals that you set for it. So that's the objective for this talk: to learn the basics of how intellectual property law, and in particular copyright, works, to understand how licenses are built on top of those principles, and then to enable you to work effectively with free and open source software, both as a consumer of someone else's work and as a creator. This is sort of an overview of what we're going to cover. It's not like you need to memorize it. It's just to anchor you as we go through and let you know what to expect coming up. But broadly speaking, there are the three big themes. We're going to cover some background, some foundations. We're going to look at some specific licenses. And then we're going to talk about some of the related practical concerns about implementing and using them. But first, a really big, important disclaimer caveat up front. I am not a lawyer. I know, right? That's like exactly what you want to hear from someone who's giving this talk. Like, yeah, that's really great. Not a lawyer. But yeah, I am not a lawyer. I'm not an expert in your country's local legal systems, and a lot of this stuff varies so much around the world. So I'm not speaking on behalf of anyone or conveying legal advice. This is general, non-specialist background information. We're going to cover about 80% of the material that around 80% of the lawyers in the home countries of maybe 80% of you would probably give in response to, let's say, 80% of your questions. So we are talking at a high level about what can be a pretty deep subject. But fortunately, that actually covers almost everything that you really need to know to operate on a day-to-day basis. And if you do really need to know more because you have a specific legal question, I'm not bothered. You should take that to an actual lawyer because you're not going to get that from any talk or reading Wikipedia or the internet or whatever. I'm glad that's out of the way. Let's actually get started by looking at what is intellectual property. Intellectual property is kind of weird because the term covers a whole grab bag of kind of really unrelated things that just have one attribute in common, which is that the law gives the creator of an intangible creation of the mind certain rights that it withholds from everyone else, even though there isn't necessarily a physical thing that you can protect and hold and keep away from everyone else. It's just ideas. So for this talk, the kinds of intellectual property we're going to look at are copyrights, patents, and trademarks. Copyright is what this talk is mostly about. The idea is that to encourage people to make expressive, creative works, we have laws that give them exclusive rights to copy, distribute, build upon, and modify that work, even though there may be no technical restriction that would otherwise keep anyone else from doing the same. Copyright is given to the creator of a work completely automatically. You don't have to do anything to get copyrights or to keep them. That used to not be the case, but for a really long time now, it's all been fully automatic. In particular, you don't need to stick a little bit of text like copyright C in a circle 2016 John Doe. You don't need to put that on your work. You get the copyright completely automatically. And that gives you the right to control how it's used for a limited time. Actually, I say a limited time, and that's the theory. But in practice, no copyrights have actually expired in the United States since the 70s. Every time that we get close to what would be the new deadline, the law gets changed retroactively to extend the duration. But that is the topic for another talk. Moral rights are a very closely related concept to copyright. In some countries, they're considered just a subset of copyright, and in some places, they're a little bit different, and in some places, they don't even exist at all. So they're very vague, and they vary a lot from country to country. And moral rights are sort of the non-commercial part of copyright. It's not so much about making money off of your creation, it's about things like the right to be identified as the author, or the right to the integrity of the work. And integrity in this context means keeping people from changing or presenting your work in ways that you don't like putting on a display and defacing your art, even if they own it. Moral rights also behave differently. For example, they might not be time-limited. They might actually last forever. They might even last beyond your lifetime and pass down to your heirs and descendants. So your grandkids maybe will have a say in what people are allowed to do with your software. And in some countries, you cannot waive, reject, or give away or sell your moral rights. It's just not allowed, like how you are not allowed to agree to be murdered. We'll talk a bit more later about the implications of that, and it turns out that, yeah, the fact that in some countries you cannot get rid of your moral rights, that turns out to be really important. But the next big kind of intellectual property I want to talk about briefly are patents, where copyright was about creative works, patents are about protecting functional inventions. The deal is that you share the details of how your new gizmo works, and society, in exchange, gives you this exclusive monopoly on the invention for a little while. Now, for the purposes of this talk, which is about licensing, we're mainly concerned with patents as they relate to snaky patent trolls and some of the tricks that they can try to pull. For example, the owner of a patent might try to get their patented software technique adopted as part of a standard, so that anyone who implements that standard then has to pay them money for a license or risk being sued. Or they might even actually themselves contribute the code that implements their patented technique. And then later, either because they planned this in advance or just because they changed their minds, they might come back later and try to sue you for using that code that they themselves contributed to your project. So some licenses have protections against this kind of thing. And when we talk about those licenses, I will call that out specifically because it is a great thing to have in a license. Also, as a side note, there's something called a design patent, which covers the way a product looks, and that is not the same thing as a regular patent. It doesn't work the same way, it's not meant to cover the same kind of things, but because it also has patent in the name, you sometimes see people getting confused and angry and saying stuff like, oh no, so-and-so is trying to patent the rectangle or the color blue. And if you hear stuff like that, don't get worked up. Just send them a link to the Wikipedia page on design patents, which are not regular patents. Really quickly, last up, trademarks. The idea behind a trademark is to protect consumers from fakes that might be trying to take advantage of the good reputation of a particular brand by imitating or copying their name or logo or identifiers like that. Now, this doesn't usually come up in software licenses directly, but it can definitely be an issue for software projects, especially user-facing ones that have brands and reputations to protect. You might remember that in 2013, the Python Software Foundation actually had to fight for the name Python. And up until very recently, earlier this year, the Debian GNU Linux distribution had to ship Firefox under the name Iceweasel with a really cute, different little blue logo because of disagreements about trademarks, even though the licensing of that code was perfectly fine. That was a friendly disagreement, though, and both sides had very good points, and they've now sorted it all out as of last month, which is great. But again, most licenses don't have anything to say about trademarks, but you should know what they are because they do come up for software projects. If you expect end users to be able to recognize the name and brand of your project, then maybe spend some time to think about what rights or requirements you might want to give to people who fork your code. Can they associate that new project with your brand? In general, though, just try not to rip off anyone's name or logo. There are other kinds of intellectual property as well, but they're not really relevant to software licensing, so we're just going to ignore them. That works out well. So why do we need licenses at all? Well, intellectual property law is a reality, whether you like it or not. And since copyright is both so powerful and automatic, we have to live with it and operate within its boundaries. But it's not just a bunch of restrictions. We can actually also work within the confines of the law to achieve the outcome that we want for our software. We can use the laws in ways that are beneficial and that actually help spread our work. So a license is a set of permissions that you give to someone. When you create something like a piece of software, you alone have the right to it, and you have control over how to share those rights with others. And a license is what we use to give people rights they wouldn't ordinarily have, like the right to use the software, to modify it, or to copy and share it. Licenses can also be used to set conditions or create obligations. The most obvious example is, of course, proprietary software, which generally has a license that only gives you the right to use it, but prohibits you not just from copying and sharing it, but also from things like reverse engineering it, or in some cases, even from really wild stuff like benchmarking the performance of the software and sharing that data. Some proprietary database licenses have that. And I mean, that's a pretty odious example of a requirement in a proprietary license, but free and open source software licenses usually also have obligations and requirements that come with them. They're just of a different nature, and we'll look at some of those in a minute. Usually, if you don't comply with the obligations that a license creates, you lose all the rights that it would otherwise have given you, and there might be other penalties on top. But the key idea is that without a license, no one has any rights to the software, and the license is the thing whereby the creator grants those rights. And no, just publishing the source code, like by throwing it up on GitHub without a license, that does not give anyone any rights. That is not code you can use. It's just code you happen to be able to look at. Like how you can probably see my laptop sitting up here right now, and you can look at it, but you don't have the right to take it home. Without a license, that code is not for your use. All right, enough background. Let's actually look at some licenses. The first category I want to talk about are known as permissive licenses, and these are the simplest kind. They're often very short, very quick to read through. And they almost, but not quite, but they almost just say that you can do pretty much whatever with the software. You can even build proprietary code on top of the code that's been shared. You usually just have to provide attribution, meaning you have to give credit to the person who wrote it. And there's often, or usually, there's also a warranty disclaimer that says that the author isn't responsible for what you do or how badly you mess up using the code. And that is a really good idea to have, by the way. You should not use a license that does not have a warranty disclaimer. Now, you would generally pick a permissive license like this when your goal is just for the code to be shared and used as widely as possible. You're trying to make life as easy as possible for developers by making everything available to them for whatever use they want, even if they don't want to reciprocate by sharing their improvements back to you. And that's a very pragmatic approach. It's very business friendly. And having companies who care about improving the quality of your code and who can pay people to work on it, that can be really powerful. Just be sure that you really would be okay with seeing someone make a lot of money off of your work and give you nothing in return, because that can and does happen, and it's well within their rights. So people from the communities around these licenses usually talk about the term open source, not about free software. And it's very non-political, non-activist. It's about just the practicality of the process of developing in the open. It's about working more efficiently, not about overthrowing copyright. There are a number of licenses like this. Here's a bunch, or a subset of some of the more popular ones. These ones here really only differ in minor ways. And some are more popular in certain communities. So the JavaScript world seems to be fond of the X11 and XPath licenses, which are usually just called the MIT license, just lumped together, which is also very popular with Python devs. The BSD folks, on the other hand, like OpenBSD and FreeBSD, they unsurprisingly like the BSD license. But honestly, all of these are pretty similar. If you want to go with this approach, read through these. They're like 3 paragraphs, and just pick one that you like the look of, or one that your community uses a lot. Just one caution on that suggestion, though. Don't go too overboard with the idea of just picking what your community uses, because right now, the cultural fashion is sort of to go very permissive, to maybe not even think about the question at all, and just throw the MIT license on everything. But remember that licenses are tools, and different tools serve different purposes. These are all good licenses if they do what you want them to do, the way that any brand of screwdriver is fine if you want to drive a screw. But if you actually need to hammer a nail, you should not just grab a screwdriver just because it happens to be sitting right there. So it's worth sitting down and really thinking about what you want to achieve with your project, and also what you don't want people to do with it. So if you decide that you want a permissive license, that's great, but you should actually decide that. You should think about it and reach that conclusion on your own, rather than ignoring the question and picking whatever happens to be popular right now, because the choice does matter. All right, end of that side note. There is one really popular permissive license that is a little bit different, though, and that is the Apache 2.0 license, which is named after the Apache Software Foundation. It's a little more verbose than the ones we just looked at. Instead of like 3 paragraphs, it's more like 3 pages. And it has some kind of slightly annoying requirements about putting notices in files you've changed. But it also has a really important clause that the other ones don't, and that is a grant of patent license. Which, going back to what we talked about earlier about patents, this is the kind of clause that I said is really great to have and that I'd call out, so I'm calling it out now. Now, right now, this is a bit of a wall of text, but with a little bit of editing, we can snip it down to just the important parts. So what this clause does is it makes it so that anyone who contributes to the code is also granting everyone who uses the code a license to use any other patents that would otherwise be infringed upon by the code that was contributed. So this is exactly a patent troll-killing, anti-patent ambush clause. And it actually goes even further and says that if you do sue anyone over patents related to this software, then you actually lose all of those patent licenses that everyone else granted to you. So it's almost like a mutually assured destruction, where if you start a patent war, you're opening yourself up to the same kind of retaliation. Now, do you need that for your software? It can never hurt. It's never a bad thing. But sometimes maybe you want to use a different license because it's popular in your community, or because you don't want to have to deal with the requirements about notices of modification or whatever. So you just have to think about whether your particular project is really susceptible to patent issues. Things like video codecs, for example, if you work with those are a minefield of patents. But honestly, the whole software patent field is so full of noise that it's hard to tell what might or might not be dangerous. But definitely, if you're working with anything that's high risk, I strongly recommend you use a license with a patent grant clause. And among the permissive licenses, Apache 2.0 is the best one in that regard. The second major family of licenses that I want to talk about are the copyleft ones. Historically, this is the category associated with the free software movement, which is the activist and political part of the community. It's also really the origin of most of this movement, so have some respect for your elders. These days, maybe some of the revolutionary zeal has fallen away and people are focusing more on the practical benefits of developing in the open, but it's worth understanding where all this came from and what the creators of these licenses intended. So the motivation behind a copyleft license is to promote user freedom. It's not to make life easy for developers. It is not to let you bootstrap your startup faster. It is not to invite collaboration from industry, although all of those things can and do happen, and that's great. But the goal is really to guarantee that users have the so-called 4 freedoms: the freedom to use the program as you wish for any purpose, the freedom to study it and change it, the freedom to share your program, and the freedom to redistribute your changes as well. Now, to guarantee those freedoms, the central idea that makes a license a copyleft one is that it requires you to share the changes you make under the license terms that others shared them with you. This ensures that even if many people layer changes on top of the code you've released under a copyleft license, the end users of that product will still have those freedoms that you wanted to give them. Copyleft licenses don't prevent you from making commercial software, but they do prevent you from making proprietary software. Now, unlike permissively licensed code, which people can take and do incorporate into closed source software, copyleft code spreads copyleft to other code that mixes with it. This also means that you can incorporate permissively licensed code into a copyleft project, but not the other way around. This property is sometimes described as viral. People say that copyleft infects code and spreads in this way. And I think they mean for that to sound scary and dangerous and threatening, but an organically growing viral spread of free software is exactly the point of these licenses. That is what they're meant to do. And you don't have to use them. You don't have to agree. You don't even have to agree with them, but you do have to respect them. And if your goals with your project are aligned with the free software movement, then these are probably the licenses that you want. The first and most well-known license in this category is the GPL, the GNU General Public License. And everything I said a moment ago about what copyleft is really what the GPL is, because the GPL created and defines this whole category. One key thing about it that makes it different from some of the other licenses is that the viral clause that requires you to share your code only kicks in when you redistribute the software in some way. If you just make a local copy and change it for your own use and don't give it to anyone, you're not required to share those changes. The GPL disallows you from adding other restrictions to the licensing of the software, and that's how it guarantees that the code stays free. And that obviously means you can't combine GPL code with code that's under a license that's more restrictive than the GPL, because either you'd have to violate the GPL by imposing additional restrictions, which it forbids, or you'd have to violate the other license by not imposing the additional restrictions that it requires. This is mainly an issue with the older version of the GPL that you still find a lot in the wild, the GPL version 2, which most notably is not compatible with the Apache license that we just called out as being so good, because of that excellent patent clause, which, even though it's a good restriction, it's an extra restriction, and the GPL doesn't allow that. Version 3 of the GPL, however, fixes this by also including that clause, so it's no longer an extra restriction. So GPL version 3 is both more compatible and it includes patent protections, like the Apache 2.0 license. So if you want to use the GPL, you should use version 3. And even a lot of things that were originally licensed under version 2 are actually licensed under version 2 or any later version, which is the standard recommended way to use the GPL and lets you use version 3. There is a closely related license called the LGPL. Interesting. I have lost the ability to move my slides. Oh, there we go. This works. The LGPL, the lesser GNU General Public License. It differs from the regular GPL in that the virality aspect only applies to the specific code it's attached to, not anything that's just linked to it to build a larger software application. So you can have an LGPL library as part of even a proprietary application, and you only have to share your changes to the LGPL part. It does also come with some requirements that are intended to make sure that users can always take advantage of the LGPL nature of that linked library. So essentially, users have to be able to replace the version that you've shipped with whatever version they want, which maybe that's a newer version from upstream, or maybe they have their own custom version, or whatever. The idea is that even if you ship a non-free proprietary application, if it's built on top of an LGPL library, then users will always have the freedom to control what version of that library they use. So they can maybe keep it up to date even if you've stopped supporting it, or they can change behavior that they just disagree with you about. The third big license in this category, and to be totally clear, there are lots of others, but these are the big ones. But the third one I want to talk about is the AGPL, the Affero General Public License. And the newest version of this is actually based on the GNU GPL, and so all of these form one big happy family. And this particular license was created what some people might perceive as a loophole in the regular GPL. The GPL requires that you redistribute your source to anyone to whom you have distributed the application. But there's a big category of software that never actually gets distributed to its end users. And that's networked applications, servers that users only interact with remotely through a client like a web browser. And these are obviously still big, complex applications that end users are using and which they rely on just as much as any desktop application. But technically, the software was never distributed to them. It's just running on the service provider's server somewhere. So the GPL's sharing requirements don't kick in, even if the code that was running on that server is GPL'd and meant to be shared. So the AGPL fixes that. It's very similar to the GPL, but its sharing requirements kick in even for users that just access the application over the network. And that definitely scares some people, but again, remember that different licenses are used to achieve different goals according to what the creator wants. And these copyleft free software licenses are deliberately very aggressive vehicles for ensuring the independence of users from developers and service providers that they would otherwise be reliant on. And as developers, that obviously is a bit scary for us, but think of, who are you building this software for? AGPL, LGPL, and GPL version 3, all compatible with one another, all compatible with a lot of other licenses. You can build an application that combines all of these. Not the case for older versions. Now, maybe you're looking at these choices and your head is kind of spinning and you're thinking like, this is a mess, I don't know what to do. Or maybe you're even raging like, I hate copyright law. And you conclude that you don't care about licensing, and what you want to do is just throw the software out there and let anybody do whatever they want, no license. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that. Just like you can't opt out of other laws that you don't like. I mean, I'd love to not have to pay for cheeseburgers, but I can't just go into a McDonald's and declare I'm a sovereign entity that doesn't believe in private property and hope that they give me free burgers. So if you don't have a license, no one has any rights to the code, even if you wish they did, and even if you put it up on GitHub. Now, some people still argue like, but it doesn't matter because I'm not going to sue anybody or do anything like that. You can use my code. Great, that's really nice of you to say. Please, put that promise in writing and distribute it with your code, preferably in a file named license. Except don't use your own words, just pick one of the licenses that we talked about earlier. It'll save us all a lot of trouble, and honestly, it is not that much work. Now, some of you are thinking at this point, what about the public domain? Can I just put my stuff in the public domain and forget about licenses? And for those of you who don't recall, the public domain is what we call things that are outside of copyright, either because the copyright has expired, or it wasn't eligible for copyright protection in the first place, or it was deliberately set free in this way. And yeah, you will encounter a lot of things out there that are attempting to sidestep the whole issue by more or less placing things in the public domain. Some examples of this are the unlicensed and Creative Commons 0. This is much better than nothing, but overall, I still can't really recommend it. At the very least, you should protect yourself by including the warranty disclaimer language that licenses usually have. Even the unlicensed website, which is a militant anti-license site, even they suggest that as an option. Unfortunately, they hid it away in the frequently asked questions, so it's a bit hard to find, but even they agree that you should have a warranty disclaimer for code. But the reason I can't recommend the public domain approach has to do with those moral rights that we talked about earlier. In the Intro to Intellectual Property section, when we talked about copyright in general. And moral rights are the ones like the right to attribution. And in some places, they are irrevocable and forever. And I promised we'd talk more about that later. Well, later is now, and this is why they matter. When you say that you're putting something into the public domain, or that people can do literally anything, you're trying to give up those moral rights. And in some places, that is just not something that the law lets you do. Again, just like you can't sign a contract agreeing to be murdered. The law actually limits what actions you can take that it believes are detrimental to you. And usually this is put in place for really good reasons. It's to protect against coercion, to protect against exploitation. It just happens to work against us in this case when we're doing it voluntarily. So when you attempt to give up the moral rights that you can't give up, you're creating a legal uncertainty and a risk that the whole public domain dedication you put up there is going to get thrown out and your software will be treated as if you didn't give anyone any rights at all. Because legally, that public domain dedication, depending on where you are in the world, might not be a meaningful, coherent document. It might be null and void nonsense. The Creative Commons 0 authors are actually aware of this problem, and if you read the full text of the CC0 instead of just the marketing blurb, it's really actually first a public domain dedication, followed by a full regular permissive license, with a little note that says, like, if the public domain stuff doesn't work and isn't allowed, here's a license. But if you're going to do that, you might as well just have gone with a regular license in the first place. Now, to be honest, this is mainly an issue outside of the United States and places with legal systems like the United States. But even if you are American, writing code in the USA, Please don't make life harder for people just because they come from a country with a different legal tradition, or even if they're American as well, they might operate in a country with a different legal tradition. So at the end of the day, choosing something like the unlicensed might feel a bit like it's an anti-copyright political statement, and I can sympathize with that, but really you're just creating difficulty for people in other countries, and you're not gaining anything that you wouldn't get by just using a very permissive standard license. Please think of your European colleagues and use a proper license. And on that note, I'll also ask that you please pick an existing license. Don't write your own. Yeah, the slide is pithy and kind of says it all, and I'm tempted to just leave it at that, but I'll explain why. Sometimes people correctly understand that they need a license, but they also think that their situation is somehow really unique and that they have to make up their own new license. Or more likely, they have to give a pile of money to a lawyer who will happily accept it in exchange for doing minimal work by just rephrasing the same stuff that's already in every other license. Because the truth is, there is already a license out there for every need you can think of. Find one that works for you. Every new license that shows up in the world just makes a lot of extra work for developers and lawyers who have to evaluate it and figure out whether it's compatible with all of the other licenses they're using. It grows, exponentially. And it imposes this very real cost, and you lose out on the benefits of using common licenses like shared legal precedents and the common understanding and goodwill that the community around those existing licenses have built up. You can see an example of how this plays out with Douglas Crockford's well-known JavaScript tools like JSLint, and the license to those are pretty standard, except they have the extra line, "The software shall be used for good, not evil." And now, admittedly, that is pretty hilarious, but the practical upshot of it is that Debian, Fedora, the GNU project, and a bunch of others can't carry and redistribute that from their repositories because both, obviously, they don't have no control over how end users are going to use that software, and because it's incompatible with the freedom that they want to guarantee to let users use it for any purpose, including evil. However, there is one organization that can redistribute that code, and that is IBM. Because IBM's lawyers got a special exemption where they got Douglas Crockford to put in writing, "I give permission for IBM, its customers, partners, and minions to use JSLint for evil." And yeah, again, that is hilarious. But IBM is right here. Good for them, good for them. They are protecting their users, and they're making sure that their users aren't going to end up in front of a jury somewhere arguing about whether their business practices or their political activism or whatever they're using their code for, arguing about whether they're evil or not. Would you want to, try to convince people who may disagree with you fervently about whether you've ever done anything evil? But the whole thing represents a bunch of work, a bunch of pain, a bunch of wasted effort that could just have been totally avoided by sticking to a standard license. And even after all that, JSLint is still being obsoleted by JSHint, partly because it has a better license. And that's how it works for a big-name, famous person like Douglas Crockford. If you're just starting out and your project is obscure, the most likely outcome is that your software will just be ignored. People will be uncomfortable with it because of the weird license and just won't use it. So pick an existing, well-understood, common one and put your jokes somewhere else that's not the license. Now, so far we've been focusing on code, but projects are usually a lot more than that. At the very least, there's documentation. There is documentation, right? You do have documentation. Yeah, okay, good. But also there's logos, there's tutorial videos, there's all kinds of non-code things. And often all of that is just distributed under the same terms as the software, which is usually fine. Nothing wrong with that. You can do that. But remember, licenses are tools and that we can make use of to further our goals. And the goals that we have for non-code things might be different from the goals for code. For example, your code might be under a copyleft license that requires people who modify it to share their source. And that makes a lot less sense for a video tutorial or even for documentation. So you should be aware that you can license that stuff differently under terms that are more suitable to that kind of work. On the copyleft-like side, there's the GFDL, the GNU Free Documentation License, which works kind of like the GPL, except it's not for code. And then there's the whole Creative Commons suite, which has a really nifty, clever mechanism where you can pick and choose exactly how you want your license to work. They have these 4 atoms that you can combine. Attribution, meaning people have to give you credit. Non-commercial, meaning people can't make money off your work. No derivatives, meaning people can't change your work. And share alike, meaning that if people do change your work, they have to release it under the same license. And you can combine any of those to make your own license, except attribution is not optional because of the moral rights issues, and share alike and no derivatives are mutually exclusive. So to sum all of that up, you might have something like Creative Commons attribution share alike, meaning you have to be credited as the author and all changes have to be shared under the same terms. And that's like a copyleft license. Or you might have a license where you say commercial use is prohibited, but otherwise do whatever, and that's like a hippie license. But it's up to you. And these options work really well for stuff that isn't code. And at the end of the day, you should just know about them so that you can deploy them strategically when you need to help your project succeed. Different tools for different jobs. Now, so far, we've talked a lot about how to share something that's entirely your work with the world. What about things other people are contributing? Or what about when you're just adding a small piece to an existing code base? There are a few options to be aware of. At one end, at one extreme, there's copyright assignment. And this basically means that the owner or manager of a software project wants contributors to actually give them the ownership of that copyright. Not just license them to let them use it, but actually make them the copyright holder. Unless you really, really, really trust the manager of that code base, this is not something you should agree to. It just puts you in a really ugly situation where the owner of that repository can do things like take the entire code base proprietary and lock you out of your own work. There are some exceptions, like if you have some really specific targeted reason that you want that person to own it, like if you have an agreement with the Free Software Foundation that they're going to bring a GPL enforcement lawsuit. That is not a common situation, and if you're in that situation, you know enough to make your own decisions. A bit less extreme is something called a Contributor License Agreement, a CLA, and this is just a document that you might have to sign before the project owner will accept your code. You still keep the copyright, but there's a specific agreement in place that covers what rights they have, how they can distribute your code, and so on. And these are a bit of a hassle because you have to usually actually sign something, but they can be okay, they can serve valid reasons, but they do vary a lot. So it's impossible to generalize about whether they're good or bad. You're just going to have to read the specific one you're presented with very carefully and decide whether you're okay with it. By the way, the Python Software Foundation one that covers contributing to Python is fine, it's good, nothing weird in there. Finally, the most lightweight option, and in my opinion the best one, is something called the Developer Certificate of Origin, DCO. And this is something the Linux kernel project came up with, and it's basically just a statement where you say that, yes, you have the right to submit this code to the project, either because you wrote it or because the person who did said that you could, and yes, you agree that the project can distribute it under the same license as their other code. It's very lightweight, very low hassle, there's no signing of paperwork, you just say, yes, I agree to this. In fact, for projects using Git for version control, you can even have Git automatically tag your commits with your sign-off. And what this provides is protection for the project. If it turns out that you lied and you're trying to sneak in code that you shouldn't have, that's now on you, because the project had good reason to believe that this was code that they could use, because you said it was. It protects maintainers both from malicious actors and from simple accidents that someone might try to capitalize on later. It also makes it guaranteed and explicit that they're allowed to incorporate your code and redistribute it, instead of just implicit because they think that you sent them that patch that they think you wrote. And as all Python developers know, explicit is better than implicit. You can easily adopt this for projects that you maintain. You just have to ask people to agree to those very short little assertions. Just search for Developer Certificate of Origin, and it comes up, and it's 4 paragraphs or something like that, very small. So now we've covered the core ideas of intellectual property law, and we've covered sharing your code, accepting contributions from others, practical things to keep in mind, and that is pretty much what you need to know about free and open source software licensing. So to wrap it up, I'll ask that you please pick a license. And when you do that, pick a license that's already established, proven, and in wide use. The Open Source Initiative, the Free Software Foundation, ChooseAlicense.com, they all maintain really good online resources with lists of licenses, their details, things to keep in mind. So just do some research there. And pick a license that makes sense in your community. For example, Perl developers tend to use the artistic license. There are other licenses that, for all practical purposes, are totally equivalent. But if you want to integrate with that community, that's the one you would choose. And pick a license that's appropriate to the nature of the work. Consider Creative Commons or GFDL for things like documentation, and do use a real full license with a warranty disclaimer for code, and if you're at risk of patent issues, one with a patent license grant. And pick a license that furthers your goals for the software. If you want to make life easy for developers and be business friendly and generally be very permissive, consider a permissive license like Apache 2.0 with its patent clause. And if, on the other hand, you want to protect users and make sure that the free commons of software continues to grow, consider a copyleft license like the GPL, LGPL, or AGPL version 3. But above all, I hope that you will now feel more comfortable navigating software licensing, and I hope you'll care about the subject, and I hope you'll care about how licenses can be tools that can work for or against you, and I hope you'll think about how to license your software instead of doing nothing or guessing at a default. And I hope that you'll find ways to make this work for you and that it will actually help you. It'll help you accomplish what you set out to do when you first sat down, started your project, and wrote that first creative and copyright protected line of code. Thank you all. No, I think we're all good. I guess my mic isn't. Is this on? Yeah, this is how to contact me. I'd love to chat with all of you. I'd love to hear if I didn't cover something or you would have liked to hear about something in more depth. I'll be around all conference, and afterwards also this is how to get hold of me in a variety of media.